Good evening. My name is Christian Hubert. I'd like to welcome you to the last event of the SCI-Arc Fall Series and to thank the Student Lectures Committee for their fine work in putting together this series. It seems to be my lot, although I have never been to Toronto, to introduce our guests from Canada. Canadians are sometimes thought of as the kind of stealth aliens because they can infiltrate American culture without our knowing it. Just how alien Brian Boigon is a question that I think will be raised this evening. There are those who, upon good authority, claim that that he is not from Earth, that his brain has migrated to another planet, which may perhaps be the Planet X of the Daffy cartoon, which he's very fond of. Brian was trained as an architect at the University of Toronto, somewhat under family pressure, I gather, but he never intended to practice as an architect. And after school did installation art, waited on tables, which seems to be the lot of marginal artists, and was eventually discovered. He worked as an editor of Impulse magazine, which is a very influential art journal, for 7 years, and wrote articles for them. And in the last 4 years has been teaching studio at the University of Toronto. These studios have concentrated on designing in cyberspace, that's to say building in the telefield of fax, modems, PCs, telephones, through the doorways of software design and the problem of inhabitation of the telefield. The cartoon he is currently working on, called the Cartoon Regulators, is an agent of that inhabitation. Brian believes that architects belong there, that nerds and designers of software are not really the people who should be building that place, and he certainly practices what he preaches. During the past 3 years, he has also organized a series of events in Toronto called Culture Lab, which takes cultural theory and brings it into popular culture, out of the academy and onto the dance floor. And Brian acts as a kind of DJ, sampler, mixer of culture in that context. Currently, he's teaching a studio at the University of Toronto called APT, Alien Predator Terminator. In which the students use the special effects of the monsters, particularly their own scopic field, to design in that environment. He's working with a Japanese think tank called UDR, Urban Design Research Incorporated, which is speculating about the city of the 21st century and working on his cartoon where the central characters are named Ram and Ram. So I'm very happy to have Brian, and I'm glad we have matching hats. This is, by the way, the book of Culture Lab, which has just been published by Princeton Architecture Press, and Brian is also the author of a book called Speed Reading Tokyo.
Thank you, Christian. That was great. Interesting to listen to one's history in 4 minutes. Can I have that light toggled? Thank you. I'm going to do mostly reading, but I'll try and keep it as friendly as possible so you don't fall asleep on me. I want to just tell you that tonight my presentation will be entitled Wild Thang, and I'll be speaking in part about my cartoon animation, the Cartoon Regulators. But for the purposes of tonight's presentation, I'll be presenting stills without motion. I'm, in fact, in the middle of rewiring my characters, so like most of reality, I'm still trying to catch up with my own special effects. And in fact, while my texture of mapping precedes the reality principle of authenticity, one could also say that the broadcast city, that is Los Angeles, no longer precedes this reality principle either, but invents it for the public. What is real about Los Angeles is everything and nothing. But by what audacity, may you ask, that I should presume to know Los Angeles at all, or at least better than you do? Did you come here to see some critical tourist bullshit on the crystal surface of an already worn-out pavement? Yet I believe I can speak as a Los Angeles phantom. That is, I saw your riots on my own TV, and I saw your studio films in my shopping mall back home. I even learned to watch and learn from your fashion kicks, from the local homeboy hip-hop spin, watch it make its way up to Canada, where in fact hoods actually make a lot of sense in the winter. And maybe I even learned how to fight a little. This is where I shall begin my pathway into the wilds of my cartoon cabin. Tonight, I'd like to reintroduce to you, for those of you who don't know this person, the quintessential warrior from LA, that is Bruce Lee. We all know the recent tragedy of Brendan Lee that shook the film and martial arts world. In fact, his father died of circumstances that were equally ambiguous. In fact, Bruce Lee died apparently of an adverse drug reaction to a migraine pill that was offered to him by a host during a shooting break in his last film. Next. So, I want to introduce Bruce Lee for several reasons. First, he was the founder of an extraordinary martial art called JKD, also known as Jeet Kune Do. Secondly, his philosophy of JKD pertains to my interest in the concept of mobile regulation, which I've been developing with my cartoon animation. And thirdly, Bruce Lee's virtual self preceded him in a way that was absolutely extraordinary, in that his film roles actually embodied his subjecthood equally as well, or even better, as his body did. As with most martial arts films, the lines between special effects and reality are blurred. For example, can he really fight? Was that really him kickboxing the shit out of the bad guy? Did Claude Van Damme really headbutt that tractor trailer into the ground, or what? In martial art films, one is given a curious blend of real and hyper-real, and in the case of Bruce Lee, a virtual subjecthood that resonated and looped back into the real itself. There are, for example, moments in a fight where the theater of illusion and fake play a key role in winning. Next, please. Bruce Lee is both real and imaginary. Contrary to traditional Hollywood shape-shifting, Lee was his own double. While Claude Van Damme can fight, he came from the celluloid DNA of Hollywood martial arts, not from the ancient Chinese arts of Kung Fu and Wing Chun to do so. How can this concept, for example, a special effect double, be of use here tonight for me? I would already like to see some of you here with your double, or some of you sitting beside your double in this room. That is, I would at least hope that some of you are special effects and some of you are not. But warfare is an electronic affair now. Any closer and you'd be in the way. I'm more interested in how the fictional world of telecommutation will be able to provide optional reality doubles for everybody and everything. In fact, I'm anxiously awaiting a way into the bit stream that does not involve a keyboard, joystick, trackball, helmet, glove, mitt. All I want is a chance to allow my consciousness to be in several places at once, like Mickey Mouse. I have a little story about Mickey Mouse. It's actually a story that Joyce Nelson tells in her book, excuse me while I find my, Roadkill. She comes across a photograph of Mickey and Donald Duck with the caption reading, quote, "Mickey goes to China," unquote. And it's followed by this brief description, and I'll just read the caption. Quote, "Mickey Mouse, the world's most famous rodent, entertains a group of young fans at the Great Wall of China, one of the world's most famous landmarks. Mickey and his cartoon chum, Donald Duck, were visiting China yesterday to promote their new weekly television series, Mickey and Donald," unquote. Now, Nelson makes an interesting point about the fact that the word cartoon is contained in the phrase Mickey and his cartoon chum Donald Duck, that one already knows Donald is a cartoon, so why underscore it? Her answer to this is to suggest that by calling Donald Duck a cartoon, it can then be symmetrical with calling the Great Wall of China a landmark. That is, landmark and cartoon become synonymous with China and the United States. When we then have two promotional campaigns, Chinese landmark and the American cartoon, and we have the conflation of two realities, a cartoon reality and a physical reality. It is the conflation of these two realities that is of paramount interest here tonight, the reframing of Roger the Rabbit, the Wayne's World of cartoon reality, where life and cartoons mix to form not one virtual world, but thousands of virtual cool worlds. Next, please. My second point about Bruce Lee pertains to his philosophical position around his fighting system known as JKD. Now, I can't get into the whole construction of his fight here, but suffice it as to say that he underscores his whole approach to JKD by saying two very important things. One, he says that learning JKD focuses on learning the attributes of movement, not the techniques. He emphasizes attributes over techniques to suggest that the system is an organic one, one which can be absorbed like a liquid into the skin. One does not learn, as he puts it, the mechanics, but rather the organics of this dynamical fighting system. Next. To give you an example, this is a double-end bag. It's a punching bag that is held taut at the top and the bottom, is used by boxers, and Bruce Lee adapted it in his training facilities. And it's a very irregular practicing piece of equipment, because you never know when this thing is going to come at you and from what angle, and it requires a certain deftness of skill to react to this bag that concentrates mostly on the attribution of space in front of you and its calculation, and not your technique of fighting per se. Now, this point is more easily conceived by way of JKD instruction, which I'm not going to give anybody tonight, nor could I, but the roots of JKD shed light on the whole notion of attribution. First, JKD was not conceived of as a closed system, but rather one that begins in the middle of a fight, so to speak. That is, it is quite literally the handiwork of Bruce Lee, who, along with colleagues like Dan Inosanto, who still teaches JKD in Los Angeles today, organized and choreographed and grafted no less than 26 movements derived from several fighting systems into one overall system known as JKD, incorporating British boxing, karate, the Chinese art of Wing Chun, Kung Fu, Filipino kickboxing, the French savate, just to name a few. What Bruce Lee did, in effect, was take what he considered to be the most effective attributes of each of the fighting systems and compile them into a super martial art, a kind of hyper-combat system. Next. Interestingly, it is this pliability of form, the crossing over into several practices of combat, that has made JKD one of the more effective martial arts. But more significantly here, it underlines the significance of performative assimilation. We are the Borg, we will assimilate you. We are not in Kansas anymore, we are in the holodeck. Again, what I'm interested in here is the way in which Bruce Lee saw his system as an organic field, one which people could take over, assimilate into their world, and jettison the jazz that did not work for them. The very idea of a dynamical system that evolves through graphs and assimilations is one which I've attempted to incorporate into the mobile space of my own cartoon animation and its spatial attributions. Now, let me get back to the broader field of the cartoon's informational matrix. Next. As many of you in this room already know, the telephone is going to explode, as is the television, into a series of functions that will rob the television of its screen, suck your credit cards into a magnetic slot, put video feed into your head, make the receiver into a room phone, become the doorbell, mailbox, and break down the last bastion of the telephone's territoriality, the division between the voice and the body. The phone is reaching a new level of penetration and shedding its primitive mechanicals like the telephone cord and home answering machine. Remember, the telephone was the first technology to double our bodies. And remember, the telephone cord was the first murder weapon used of the new technologies. What is presently wrong with virtual reality today is, of course, that you must suit up, like you're going to go out in the snow, which some of you may or may not know about. And who wants to commit that much body time to count them one reality? I'd rather be in voicemail. Honey, it's for you. It's Henry's cartoon calling. And now this. We no longer need bodies to do business, so why would you need a virtual space to shake hands in unless you could do it without the scuba suit and send in probes? I say for everyone a probe, for everyone a cartoon. While most of you have witnessed the development of the three big bangs of technology, telephone, television, telecomputer, there have been some other events in the gadgetry field that have, through the act of mobile portability, given us new relationships to the society of the production of cultural geometry. In my mind, they begin with three inventions. And then these have since evolved, of course, into the great appliances that are contained and multiplied throughout our home, car, and streets. They are, and I'll use the name brands of these in particular because historically those names appear and are important for the development of the technologies. The Xerox machine, the Sony Walkman, and lately the Barcode Battler. Next. The telephone did to the voice what the photocopier, I'm having trouble with my shelf, sorry, what the photocopier did to the image. It made it rub up against its copy and made the word durable synonymous with copy. With the advent of this technology, the camera and the sketchpad merged to form the basis of a new instrument. It is the copier that made originality a word of the past and master a word of the present. We now have the master, which is a modeled original, made specifically for copying. In fact, the master is not necessarily a good original, but a servant of the copy. Its sole purpose is to become a copy. The change from original to master is a significant one. It means that we no longer yearn for the experience of originality, but rather the ecstasy of a good copy. Now the photocopy machine is folded into the laser printer and fax machine. Soon the copier will lose its status as a single breed and become part of a hybrid gadget. Now the copy machine has become a scanner, no longer needing a trace of paper to follow. The copier has become a copy gun, a ray gun for vacuuming the polka dot duck off a photographic image. And now the copy machine is attached to your phone, fax, and phone. Now the fax phone is part of your home and an implant in your body. Next. The Sony Walkman. McLuhan once said that North Americans go outside to be private and inside to be public. And Europeans, these are gross statements of course, go outside to be public and inside to be private. What one neglects to tell in this little aphorism from McLuhan is that he also suggested that North Americans went outside to be private and public by driving around in their cars. It was the car that allowed a whole new host of public-private interfaces to emerge. Sony made sound private in public. Sony made the big leap and took Marshall McLuhan out to a very private but very loud lunch. Now, while the Ghetto Blaster took music to the streets in an act of interception, music could become invasive, a mobile appliance and a piece of box jewelry. By the late 70s, sonic performances were being rigged up, siphoning the electronic services off of lampposts in Central Park in New York City to amplify the blaster effect. But the Walkman took to the streets in a whole new way, making the attributes of being in two places at once a virtual reality, being outside and inside in public. Perhaps I could even suggest that it was the Buddhist temperament which manufactured the Walkman inside, outside, inside paradigm. We now have the portability of recording and producing in real time. Next. The Barcode Battler. This is a new game that's just been marketed, and I'm sure it's available in Los Angeles, but it first appeared in the streets of Japan, entitled The Barcode Battler. It uses barcodes to enhance a player's game. Contestants slide a barcode through the battler card slot, which you can see at the bottom edge, and the game changes its course. The newest version of this game is called Conveni, which warehouses barcodes endorsed by several corner store confectionery companies. Now the corner store is a barcode haven. Children seen conning their parents to buy this box of chips over that, since the barcode is better for their game. Next. This is a Barcode Battler card that comes with the game, but you can also take barcodes off of any product source in a store and run it through the system. What is more significant, though, is how the barcode and the video game have interfaced to form a new reality principle. That is, make reality bend toward fiction and life becomes exciting again. And now this, a binary code will hit your car bumper for instant toll payments and can transcribe the DNA off your lips, read your imprint, and read just about every part of yours or anybody else's body. Next. The barcode invention sits somewhere between the psychoanalysis of fire and time-release drugs. On the one hand, it reduces everything to the same state, not carbon but numeric, and on the other hand, it has added a virtual control gate in every system of commodity exchange known to humankind. Next. Imagine, if you will, a deep, dark forest. Imagine a pathway leading into it, which you begin to follow. Hours pass and you suddenly find yourself in the middle of a clearing. A sweet aroma of burning pine overtakes your sense of direction, leading you to follow its course through the ever-deepening foliage. You are now standing in front of a cartoon log cabin. Smoke is coming out of its chimney. As you approach, the cabin begins to fill its surfaces with electric light. The entire cabin is suddenly liquid as it pulsates with every surge of electricity. You gather up enough courage to open the door. It opens with an ease that startles you at first and then calms your hands and feet long enough to negotiate the entry of your body. You are inside the cabin now. Next. Suddenly, a flash of light hits your eyes, followed by the most awesome thing. The Mario brothers are there talking to you, asking you how much money you want for your body. They want to know if you could trade bodies with them for a few days so they can get some shopping done. They want your barcode. Next. The interaction of what has been called real-time activity, that is real-time teletext activity, also involves, as its very name suggests, a collapse of the real and the representational. Perhaps then, rather than speaking of the car, radio, CD, or television video as simply another ever-ready box in the technological furniture layout, we should think of them as wave-world spaceships, capable of sustained lived properties of inhabitation, dwelling right under the skin of wave-form transmissions. While all of you here are just waiting for fiber to the burbs and cable to the curb, I'm trying to figure out how to design a wave dwelling, how to get my body into the data highway without having to wear all the gear and pretend I'm Jacques Cousteau. But how does one begin from the cave to the surfboard to design a wave dwelling? How, for example, does an earthling stay here and yet go there, stay and go everywhere? The answer to this question is one which would certainly make somebody a whole lot of money, not to mention cross over into a world of ethical concerns like should I keep my eyes or take Madonna clones on the black market. And then, rather than generalizing an answer to the problem of the wave dwelling, I will present a brief foray into my work, which at least I hope can illustrate some of the possible directions of this bitstream information. However, next, before I just enter into that presentation, I need to define a few terms, the first of which is quite simple and straightforward: diagrammatical reality. What is diagrammatical reality, and how did Sanford Quinter and I come to coin this phrase in a studio not so long ago? I remember, in fact, that the term first entered our minds when thinking about sports and hopscotch. For one thing, I was always fascinated with the role of geometry in competitive sports. Football, the integer system, hockey and baseball's descriptive geometry. For every sport, a geometry and diagrammatical reality. Where else would one be able to witness the power of geometry on the body but on the playing field? Now, if you take your spectatorship into another diagrammatical reality like information, you may be able to discern what I'm referring to here when I suggest that information is a form of diagrammatical reality. Once information can be sustained like fish in an aquarium screen, diagrammatical reality takes on the fresh dew of a playing field. For my own experiments in forecasting the future of communications, I've been exploring the role of the cartoon. That is, for me, theory is made from toys. Yet the toy is not simply a miniaturization or mimicry of adult props, but is truly the experimental field for new gadget testing. One need only to realize that play, children's play, extends technology beyond its practical limits to see just how a child might fill in the cracks for a new technology next. Who are the Mario Brothers, and why are there so many of them? 23 million copies of the Super Mario Bros. Console game sold in America when it was launched in 1987, and 38 million Mario Brothers have sold in America thus far. The next generation of video brood will be more likely to recognize Super Mario and Sega's Hedgehog than Mickey Mouse. And of course, it's worth noting here that while Bart Simpson and the Ninja Turtles emerged as games out of the conventional swamps of comics and TV, Mario jumped, as it were, out of an arcade game developed by Nintendo called Donkey Kong, which was a basic King Kong, chase him, capture him, chase him game. The Nintendo creators argued that Mario's character was not so much created as it was digitally evolved, a real result of computing power, or in this case, lack of computing power. Shigeru Miyamoto, the director of Nintendo in New York, said that Mario Brothers' hat, mustache, and red dungarees were not there, for their cute appeal, but to make the earlier Mario show up better on low-resolution screens. Super Mario represents DNA computation, a step toward life on the other side of the screen, providing the plumbing for the next reality. Next. And now this, interactive television, a Sega game channel, and 500 stations pumped into your home from a digital corner store that's sucking signal out of the Death Star satellite. Certainly the market share of the video game entertainment industry is very important, but equally significant here is just how the cartoon has become a virtual reality of space and time for our entire population. It seems that such an overwhelming majority would warrant a closer look at the cartoon and its spatiality. A case in point, of course, is in Japan, where the cartoon itself functions in a kind of socio-political setting whereby cartoons can speak the minds of the Japanese in a particularly critical or satirical way about Japanese society without a Japanese citizen individual coming out and actually speaking directly to a source of authority. So it acts as a kind of scrim or mask for a lot of venting, which goes on consistently in these real-time publications that are put out weekly in Japan. Next, please. Now, a little bit of the Cartoon Regulators. Since I'm about to embark on a brief episode of cartoon regulation theory, it is fair to define a few more terms. First, that regulation here is constituted by cartoon genetics. And one thing is for sure. Everyone in this room is going to have to decide whether they would fuck a cartoon or not. Eisenstein once wrote about animation that, quote, if it moves, then it's alive, unquote. Next. Now a brief word about Ninja Turtles. First of all, I live near a fairground. It's called the Canadian National Exhibition. And every year this exhibition is open to millions of people for approximately 4 weeks who flock through its gates to spin on various 70s disco rides, gamble for stuffed toys, and eat non-stop sugar. And every year I am struck by the people who are leaving the grounds going to their cars with stuffed animals, humps on their backs. Perhaps this is the only time when cartoons have sex with their owners. Who knows? It is also time for real life, real drama, and real cartoons. In fact, the stuffed toy then becomes not just a one-way affect of affection, not just a special moment for 1 billion Barbie doll originals, but rather a real live multiple, a replicant 3D tune, ready to be given a voice, a sex, a desire, ready at any moment to become alive. Perhaps, if it moves, then it is not only alive, but self-regulating, and perhaps even intelligent. Next. Now, Eisenstein did some work with the Disney studios And during that time, he wrote several essays on the topic, one of which included his comparison of the animational space of the cartoon to plasmatic gases. Plasmas are reproduced by superheating a gas and exciting its molecules so they'll lose their outer shells of electrons, and the new gas thus becomes ionized and often emits light and energy in great quantities. For example, the aurora borealis would constitute a kind of plasmatic, effect. Eisenstein suggests that a cartoon possesses the ability of plasmaticness, as he states. Next slide, please. This is a fascinating condensation of a kind of Darwinian delirium by Eisenstein. Quote, "For here we have a being represented in drawing, a being of definite form, a being which has attained a definite appearance and which behaves like the primal protoplasm, not yet possessing a stable form, but capable of assuming any form, and which, skipping along the rungs of the evolutionary ladder, attaches itself to any and all forms of animal existence," unquote. Imagine, if you will, your very own cartoon regulator, capable of flow, evolution, devolution, dilution. And now this, regulator. A regulator is a mechanism designed to adapt a particular organism or machine to a given function. For example, a carburetor alters the operating speed of a machine in order to accommodate it to a particular task, slow it down, or speed it up. And now this, hydrographical space. Hydrography is a term employed by geophysical scientists in order to address the peculiar spatial qualities presented by any liquid body, be it an ocean, lake, river, pond, etc. Here I borrowed the term to similarly address the spatial qualities presented in any liquefaction process of an image through the technologies of photography, pixelation, cell computer animation, and liquid crystal screening. Next. Honey, I'm home. I am aware that the subject of cartoons may appear to fall outside the purview of what is traditionally designated architectural theory, let alone practice. But if theory has a task today, it is, I should think, to examine and address our prejudices of what is and what is not architecture. In a situation where the most intimate of dwellings, the body, has become the arena of an unprecedented technological intervention, where indeed the difference between the body, the Nike air pump, and the particular tactics and techniques which articulate it are indiscernible, it is necessary, even urgent, to cast the question of being and dwelling differently. What does it mean today to say, honey, I'm home? The terms being and dwelling are, of course, of Heideggerian vintage. Perhaps it is necessary to reorganize the voice of being as a species of technological ventriloquism, to recognize the presence of an object which is at once here and there, at once bodied and disembodied. I believe that architecture can no longer be reduced to the earthly problem of dwelling, but rather it must incorporate within its own being the popular cultural dwellings which inhabit the digital field. Let me begin by citing three such modes of inhabitation: the telecommunicative, computational, and televisual, and injecting these into the cool world of the cartoon. Next. Life in the animation lane. This might seem somewhat rudimentary, but it's necessary to go on to the genetic evolution of the computer-animated cartoon. I'm going to define very specifically the notion of cartoon animation as being any image caricaturization that is formulated through time of any person, place, or thing. If it moves, then it is alive. The animation industry itself takes this definition further by declaring that animation invokes life itself. More specifically, cartoon space is conducted in a universe parallel to ours, which is capable of paradoxical intersections, as in the case of Roger the Rabbit, which I shall touch on more specifically later. Paradox is the home of the cartoon. The cartoon paradox appears as a dismissal of depth, a display of events at the surface, and a deployment of caricaturizations along its field. Humor and its cartoons is the art of the surface, which, as Deleuze says, is opposed to the old irony, the art of depths and heights. If the cartoon is said to have its own depth of field, it is exemplary in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Deleuze gives an accounting of Carroll's surfaces. Quote, next, quote, next, quote. Yes. As one advances in the story, the digging and the hiding give way to a lateral sliding from right to left and left to right. The animals below ground become secondary, giving way to card figures which have no thickness. One could say that the old depth, having been spread out, became width. This spreading out of width, unquote, I would like to claim, is the motor field which the animated cartoon inhabits. Keith Clancy, in his essay entitled The Typology of Pyromania, by the way, when you're doing research into cartoon theory, quite often the authors of these particular research papers go off on these deliriums for titling, like The Typology of Pyromania, but in fact, this essay is quite astounding. Clancy describes hydraulic modeling, a function of the cartoon animated sequence, in the following passage where he says that everything goes from crowds, that is particles or figures, to huge swirls of color and line. In his hydraulic model, one goes from a curvilinear declination in the formation of spirals and vortices to an inclined plane, the greatest slope for the smallest angle, which is of course important in the exaggeration of animation, from bands or packs of atoms to great vertical organizations. He refers to the flows in the cartoon as ecstatic. These are his terms: twists, laughs, spins, leaps, screams, explosions, floods, overflows, turbulences, crowds, dances, spirals. In short, moments in an animation film that are characterized by excess. And of course, in our case, their opposite, the so-called ennui of the cartoon, the dumbfounded gaze, melancholia, flatness, stiffening, sleep, or I should say snoozing, snoring, staring into space, and of course there is locomotion itself, the very study of kinesthetics. The whole field of motion in the geometrical valley of cartoon space has yet to be seen as a serious site for anthropologists, let alone cyberspace, traffic engineering, or VR types. While the VR designers are trying to make a good copy out of reality, its new master, one must also take into account that all travel in the cyber field requires the re-embodiment of our body. And if we're going to leave our bodies here, then there better be better bodies waiting for us there. Next. For now, cartoon animation can be seen from the outside as creating an interface to a parallel universe. Its character and inhabitants are colonized from this world. Human colonization involves a weird set of patriotic emigrations. That is, cartoon colonization distorts the colonization duplication process even further. It is easier, for example, and more believable to humanize animals than it is to humanize humans into cartoons, Chuck Jones remarks. Next. Now, I am limiting my discussion of the regulators to animation cartoons. I realize that the still cartoon is also a potentially fertile field for investigation. However, it is the animation of the cell or computer-generated frame of the cartoon which yields the most compelling geometrical vectors for moving through data. Imagine, if you will, a world in the process of being colonized by an empire, and during its duplication, immigrants and their attendant baggage suddenly distort, hybridize, take on their own independence, intelligent individuation, and become self-organizing, reorganizing, sending the colonizing machine into a paranoid group mind warp. The degree of distortion is of little concern here. While duplication is problematized by its proximity to its original or so-called master, a distorted duplication bears no consistent relation to its copy or original. Next. Baudrillard's recipe for simulation, that is, from bad copy to good copy to pure simulation, cannot function here. The fact is that distorted duplication goes along its path where it's just as easy to suck the heat off a photocopy machine engine as it is a pit bull terrier. Animation, or invocation of life itself, not only brings with it an independence of duration of time, that is, enough time as it were to gather the dust particles for its own history, but its own conversion tables. Form is just a pretense of skin which can be peeled away at any time. Sometimes a banana is just a vertical wire frame, and sometimes it's Salvador Dali's asshole. Next. Animated cartoons are the paradoxical images that exceed the rules of colonization. Yet they have still been limited by the calibration which has restricted the cartoon's range of animate capabilities, both in and out of the entertainment industry. Computer software is chock full of animated iconography, yet these cartoon plateaus are characterized by an appropriation of taxonomy called from the 18th century Library of Congress office files. You know, the file folder and the index card, the letter, the paper letter, and the envelope. Now, when Apple Corporation tries to offer a different way to cut data, it simply hyperizes the card file system. And while the computer industry keeps on cartooning the paper-based office, cartoons in the entertainment industry have been transformed into a dense parallel world of diagrammatical architectures. I could argue, for example, that the recent films of Disney are geared for adults' remedial reality courses than for children, as is the case certainly with the Super Mario Brothers, a humanization of a cartoon, which is an interesting inversion, as well as the recent Disney Aladdin film, which plays a double entendre narrative between what the child can get and what the adult can get while both watching the film simultaneously. If cyberspace let everyone become or dispatch their own cartoon, we would no longer have cartoon files, but new ways of storing and retrieving data. No more cartoon stationery, but distorted duplicators where pages of pixelated light don't shake, shimmy, and scroll, but hop, hover, and flow. A truly animated text which glides along the width of a surface like the underground animals in Alice in Wonderland, producing and recording an infotainment net that releases all data from its burden of linearity and the chaotic attractor field of a parodic parallel universe. Next. The regulating lines of rock and roll. Every cartoon has its geometrical political history. Fred Flintstone is prehistoric Freud without the training, and Wilma is Gertrude Stein on acid. An over-the-counter history of the regulating line may be dated as far back as the beginnings of Rome. One could say that the first regulating line was a territorial one established by Romulus for the foundations of Rome. We know, however, that the lines drawn by Romulus were interrupted or interfered with by Remus. Plutarch's story could be retitled, quote, "Don't cross that line." As he says, as Romulus was casting up the ditch next, Plutarch says, where he designed the foundation of the city wall, Remus turned some pieces of work into ridicule and obstructed others. At last, as he was in contempt, leaping over it, some say Romulus struck him, others one of his companions. He fell, however, unquote. The twinning of Romulus and Remus and their subsequent rearing onto opposite sides of the fence clearly displays the distorted duplication of a parallel universe to ours, Remus playing the diabolical other to the Romulan world. Their violent interludes are even suggestive of the kind of destructiveness inherent in the cartoon genre. Next. The regulating lines of the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. Derrida once mentioned that the apocalyptic genre is perhaps the most conservative form of presentation. In fact, cartoon animation epitomizes the use of apocalyptic motifs. Something is destroyed in order to reinstate law and order. Sounds a bit like modernity to me. And yet something is destroyed always returns to life to repeat over and over the same but different moral tale. In cartoon land, the 10 Commandments are multiple choice. Most of the popular cartoons are based on construction and destruction dyads, and most of these detonating narratives are set to preserve the status quo ideology of a given society or socializing little children. Next. No animation cartoon was more apocalyptic in its regulating lines than the Chuck Jones 1949 Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote series. Seldom, if ever, for example, is a vanishing point used to convey distance. Don Graham, one of the pioneers of animation, once said, quote, "The effect of the Roadrunner film was a pure mass moving, perhaps for the first time, in pure space," unquote. In fact, if Deleuze suggests a spreading out of width constitutes a new depth, then the surface of the Roadrunner stretches it along a deep space, forming a paradoxical cartoon plateau. I suggest here that the regulating lines of these cartoon plateaus could form the basis for a new breed of motion in telecommunicational spaces. Next. This is a video game, and it's the first time that the Wile E. Coyote can talk. One only has to adapt the rules of the road devised by Chuck Jones in the Coyote Roadrunner series, and the list of motor fields is a plausible one for computer space. It's notable that in the case of cartoon animation, one of the first things that you do when developing a character is set up the limitations of the character, that is the perimeter codes of behavior that may never ever be exceeded in order to contain a certain kind of intensity and economy within the narrative episodes. So these are a couple of the rules that Chuck Jones laid down in what they call in animation industry the Bible. Rule number 1, wherever possible, make gravity the coyote's greatest enemy. Rule number 2, the coyote can stop any time if it wasn't so fanatical. Here we may recall the Ernest Jones identifying the fanatic as one who redoubles their efforts when they have forgotten their aim. Now, rule number 2 is particularly pertinent in cartoon regulation. Fanaticism may or may not be a doubling of effort. What is important here is that the cartoon acceleration finds its own desire, and that cartoons are full of regulating lines which exceed their own codes of behavior. Next. What was once a slow-moving object suddenly, under the bliss of predatory activity, becomes a chaotic mass of shredded lines which seemingly disintegrate an object and reformulate it into another at another speed, time, and even dimension. I mention the coyote here not only to extract the ecstatic movements, but all the turbulent effects it has on space itself. Architecture has done very little to brush up against this accelerator pedal in its modeling of space. In fact, architecture remains unable to incorporate the problem of telecomputational habitation. We all know it only rains in cyberspace when you want it to. And regulating lines today are not simply the lines of golden sections which skid across the surface of a plane, but rather they are the very diagrammatical realities which we inhabit every time we read the architecture of information. When the monitor at the airport displays your lover's plane has ARR, reality at that very instant is as diagrammatically real as it's going to get. Next. Nintendo, Game Boy, Girl, and Under the Thunder Dome. With Sega and Nintendo battling for invading every waking hour of a child's lifetime, cartoon animation has become a portable event. Most of the new video games are distributed, for example, in a portable master grid of isometrical perspectival spaces, that is, space seen from above, below, or straight on. And although they are the offspring of post-cell computer animation, video-mated cartoons, in particular in their game format, are relatively flat and compressed along a traditional grid. Next. Witness the way the Mario Brothers slip and slide along the thin partitions of the game facade, not stretched but plated. And as the plating becomes denser and more interactive, what one is dealing with is a new wall, the thick, thin wall, the curtain wall of cyberspace. Super Mario Brothers is perhaps the least inventive of the new video game space colonies, but it does incorporate the attributes of skipping, an option that has already made its way onto the hotspots of your personal computers. That is, one can now program different parts of the screen to be attractors, almost like erogenous zones, which when summoned can make the user jump from one point command to another on a screen in front of a pixel grid. While cell animation produced a more liquefied ground in which to design character space, computer animation provides the necessary modeling speed which the cell could never hope to obtain. I will describe this modeling speed in more detail with some of the stills of my cartoon. Next. There's a case to be made to compare the plated versus the ecstatic spaces that Keith Clancy refers to. And he describes this quite significantly, referring to this scene in Roger the Rabbit. Quote, "When given alcohol, Roger flies into the air, changes color, screams while smoke gushes from his ears, and spins around the room propelled by jets of steam that gush from circles on the soles of his soles of his feet, which are thus transformed into exhaust jets, unquote. Welcome to cartoon travel. Next. This is a VR game. It's hard to see. It's a little holographic image of a game called Play, Learn. Jim McLuhan, an editor with ID Magazine, once said that you shouldn't really pay too much attention to the content in Super Mario games, let alone any others. The fascination has more to do with what he calls the form and with the technology. He refers to it being reduced down to two things: secret knowledge and digital space. In fact, it is the one time in the history of technology where children are way ahead of adults. Miyamoto's real breakthrough in the game is to see that Super Mario is not about character narrative, but about space. Hence, Mushroom Kingdom is filled with map screens, secret passages, and dungeons housed in generic castles. The Castle Gladiator code overlaps heavy metal style, as well as hence some of the characters that look alike and pop up right out of an Axl Rose ad for LSD steroids. It's important to note as well in terms of the marketing strategy of these video games that one tries to make these liaisons with the next invasion of pop culture from, say, the video game to heavy metal rock and roll. Next. This is a boreholer from the Ninja Turtle cartoon. They all get in this thing and they can dig their way through the planet. Liquid crystal display has put an end to the dominant linearity of the pixel, but brings with it the problems associated with the gridless space. It means that although line and form itself can be self-organizing, as is in the case of morphogenetic fields, the role of time and causality remain ambiguous. That is, however, with the advent of the biological concept of the creod, which I will try to explain in some detail, the effects of time are capable of being registered, at least in terms of valleys, behavioral valleys. For instance, in order to illustrate temporal aspects of the morphogenetic field, every developmental path of an organism follows a distinct canal, or what one might call a valley or a creod. I'm sure if some of you have heard Sanford Quinter speak here, he refers to the specific term, the creod, which defines definite endpoints in a behavioral sequence. Even if genetic changes or environmental perturbations may push the course of development away from its canal, unless it is pushed over the top of its perimeter, the process of development will find its way back. It will not return to the point from where it started, but to some point later on in a position of the canal pathway of development. This represents what is known as the process of regulation. An example in kind of psychological terms would be, say, as a child, you were beaten on the shoulder consistently by one of your parents, and you kind of developed a kind of entropic condition. Your nerves were screwed up, and you ended up walking around like this. And this would be considered a kind of altercation and alteration of a behavioral canal that might have been this way, but through an environmental invasion turned out to be this way. What's suggested in the definition of the canal or the creod is that as long as this course of development isn't pushed over the top of the perimeter, kind of in a figurative way of speech, the development of my entropy will move back to this position, given thousands of dollars worth of therapy, but nonetheless it could kind of return to its normative position. At least that would be the theory. And this is also true in cartoons. So regulation, or in the case of cartoons, creotic regulation then is a perfect analog for cartoon regulation, let alone psychoanalysis. The animated cartoon produces creods that characterize behavior and canals through a narrative cell frame, incorporating all the cuts, diversions, and interruptions to its motor field without ever abandoning the definition of the endpoint, or, as in the case of Chuck Jones, those rules which make up the characterological game of the cartoon. In other words, cartoon animation canals are always regulated by their initialization through time. The roadrunner may divert its course, or valley, but will always return to it sometime later. Next. This is one more piece of information before I go on to some of the stills from my animation. This deals with the hard and the soft toy. Hard toy, soft toy. It's a concept that Winnicott developed, a child psychologist. We often spoke of the difference between the soft toy, that is blankets and stuffed animals, and hard toys, appliances and trucks. The hard toy is for the most part one which follows existing industrialized pathways, ovens, trains, cars, carts. Even the ultimate hybridized hard toy, the Transformer, with all its metamorphic shifts from industrial-scale robots into handheld guns, still follow the predictable anatomical lines and joints of the body machine. Soft toys are much more ambiguously pre-rooted. In fact, one might even say they do not have pre-existent valleys or creods or behavioral canals. For example, the blanket is a quintessential creotic device since it lays open any path in any direction. Yet once the child rubs in or canals a pathway, it becomes a fixed behavioral valley. If cartoon regulation followed the same model in cyberspace, the canalization of soft toy affects, that is, the liquid crystal display screen acting as a user's blanket, could produce the innovative routes necessary for a new type of inhabitation in cyberspace. Next. The Cartoon Regulators is a computer-generated cartoon animation, and its main priority is to introduce beings into the spatial problem of diagrammatical reality, that is, agent beings, representatives, agents. The animation engages dynamical systems of information as wet, hydrographical, speedy, turbulent, and adrenalated, ecstatic. The Cartoon Regulators have treated these surfaces of information as candy-like organisms. Next. Using the same alias research software used by Industrial Light and Magic for The Abyss and Terminator 2, the regulators feature a liquid space of mobile data where information is no longer inorganic but alive. The Cartoon Regulators was first conceived as an infinite cartoon, and its foremost program was to probe the spatial and mobile features of cartoon animation and import these findings into the telecommunicational field. Just aside, in terms of the technicity of this production, this is a still image that's produced off a 3/4-inch tape from an SGI system, Silicon Graphics system, which ran Alias Animator 2. This image was printed at about 6 foot square to study the more complex spaces of the construction, and it's considered, in my mind, the base character map of the 2 central characters in my cartoon animation. It's worth noting here that the cartoon that I'm developing is not for adults, but for children, so some of the personification affects are directed at children, and some of them aren't specifically worked out yet. The title, The Cartoon Regulators, emerged out of the research I was conducting and looking at the mobile spaces of cartoon animation. I not only became interested in how the producers of cartoon animations had actually developed sophisticated ways in which to move information through space, but how, for example, one scene could pack in so much information. And it seemed to me that with the exception of painting and perhaps the enigmatic overlay of architectural, mechanical, electrical, working drawings, no other pictorial spaces had developed to carry such a dense set of representations. I'll just interrupt here to give you a breakdown of the 2 characters, which I'll name for now, Rom and Ram. Doesn't matter which one is which. They're canisters. They can convert information from digital to analog or analog to digital. They're basically samplers. They get into trouble. They're kind of the electronic versions of Chip and Dale. The program of the actual character itself is composed of 3 primary components: a probe, which you see on the top, that little kind of Rossi-esque cone, and a cylinder sections coming off of the main canister, which are both lenses and turbine gear components when they go into a kind of more Victorian spaces. And there's a soft bottom, which is a liquid procreative surface for reproduction. And if you lift off the top of the canister, the central character, there's a series of slots for software. Softer software. Next. How did the cartoon animation industry develop these fictional spaces, which were so much more animate than our own computer spaces, which are much more like typewriters than video games? Next. The first cartoon animations were cell-generated, frame by frame, and linked together, for example, in the case of Walt Disney. This method is still used today, and of course it dates back much before Walt Disney. But the new cartoon techniques are computer-generated, and in this case, characters are designed on a computer and given life by stretching them. Next. It's hard for me to do this because usually I'm banging them quicker. Stretching them into action rather than interlinking them like cells. You present nodal points of a character moving from left to right, say 1, 2, 3, very similar to architectural drawings where you have typical, atypical, and then you press, instead of build, you press, stretch, or warp, and you get this linkage of animation. This is the second method of computer linking that I've been using in my work. Next. This is the wireframe diagram of the first still that you saw, the two ROM and RAM features, and it goes through some of the basic sort of underpinnings or carriages, chassis of these creatures. This is the first layer of the wireframe, so they're in fact rudimentary here. They contain about 100 times as much wireframe than this when they finally get moving through space. Next. Okay, I'll go through this rather quickly. This is basic desktop working platform of an alias software system, and they're the quick renders that you can go back and forth to compare against the wireframes. For the most part, one works in a wireframe just like you do in your rendering systems, I'm sure here. However, what's interesting in terms of this hardware is that once you build up the model of a three-dimensional object, you can then go about compressing it and flattening it and going through isometrical modeling in 4 quadrants and then blowing it back out to its systemic position or whatever wavelength you want to. The organism, of course, is first constructed out of a wireframe mesh-like lattice that mimics the kinesthetics of anatomical movements. Bodies are erected like skinless organisms ready to be wrapped in a liquid hydrographical substance. This is also called texture mapping. Each frame interlinks with another until the entire field of wires and lines amalgamate to form a kind of cartoon appliance. Next. Every sector of movement is predestined by the assemblage of wire frames. Like a woven net, each line reacts like a vortical thread of tension, stretching and torquing into another dimension. Next. When Rom was casting up a ditch, Ram ridiculed his work, jumping over the line and taunting Rom. Some say Rom killed Ram, others say he reintegrated him into the DNA data ditch. Rom equals read-only memory, RAM equals random access memory. Here you can see the probe device on the RAM on the right, stretched out somewhat like Terminator 2, but basically that probe can insert itself into a data field and yank out a series of information similar to a Ninja Turtle boreholer that's cutting through the earth. This thing cuts through information like a library or whatever. While the problem of being in the telecommunication field of new technologies is foremost, being is mobile ID. And since ROM and RAM are embedded with several wire frames, their characters can express a series of ID metamorphoses, mutations, and conundrums. The regulators are able to respirate with data, shapeshift into the environment, join and reorganize themselves. Furthermore, each computer film still depicts one attribute of a typical motion path in the cartoon regulator sequences. Next. Motion paths are like tracks, that is, train tracks, except in this case they're laid down behind the figures, invisible, and some of these tracks are Indy 500 tracks, roller coaster tracks, motion paths, which are for the most part non-Cartesian. What I've done is in the construction of the animational pathway sequence, grafted these motion paths together and culled them from any number of sources, including kind of wave drawings from Ninja Turtle. For the most part, I try to stick to these diagrammatical motion pathways, which are gridless and fluid-like paint, and each motion path sets up a spatial parameter for movement in the cartoon data field. Next. The characters are developed in a nonlinear space of narrative, not one narrative, but several narratives at once. Rather than file folders, cartoon families. Rather than remote control transceivers, cartoon wave ships. Each motion path sets out a spatial parameter for movement in the cartoon data field. In the future, all cartoon regulators will be subject to the incursions of a user's joystick, cascading ROM and RAM down a series of turbulent pathways, contours, valleys, and non-sites. Quote, "It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils, with an anxiety that almost amounted to agony. I collected the instruments of life around me that might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light next, I saw the yellow, dull eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this point? How do I delineate the wretch whom, with such infinite pains and care, I endeavored to form? His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath, his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dull white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips." Mary Shelley Wollstonecraft, 1816. Next. User A grabs hold of the soft stick and jams it forward, making its tune skip along the next data plateau. ROM hovers at 44 meg and then toggles its digit suction switch, inhales a whole section of the data field up into its carousel. RAM drills down into the hardcore flesh of the mainframe and reworks several network boards until they both slide down a ramp, landing in an orgasmic field of liquid sex, dust, and dirt. User B carves a data line into the surface of a TV commercial and rips into a box of breakfast cereal, sending the entire contents into a flurry of flight, dispersing across thousands of digital bit devices. User A finds user B in the bit stream and disintegrates him or her in the microdust. ROM and RAM spin off into the sunset. Next. Next. This is a procreation scene. Group sex, Bob, Ted, Carol, and Alice. And also, it's a scene which shows how the cartoon features multiply and create different kinds of turbine movement given the context of their landscape, seascape, airscape, telecommunicational scape, whatever. Next. Inhabitation is no longer a question of being and dwelling on an earthly plane, but rather a question of where to yell, "Honey, I'm home." And in the future, there will be no more screens. Everyone will be receiving laser images projected directly on their retinas. Everyone will become a petite cinema, capable of receiving and transmitting data across someone else's spectral eyes. Ever since the invention of the cartoon animation, narrative has never been the same. No longer is the cartoon subject to its own entertainment space, but rather is let loose onto the infinite subscape of the telefueled networks, telephones, fax machines, computer terminals, automated teller machines, and laser scan cashiers. If virtual reality is going to become a new frontier, it will need to have new thinking, and that requires dropping the gloves and looking around the room to see who may be human and who may not be. Maybe some of you are polystyrene jokes, and maybe this building is. One of the attributes of the cartoon as well is to affix different orifices, different holes, bear traps, and to change the mouths to integrate different ways of assimilating data through kind of more visceral means like bear trap, like grabbing data in these kind of random pincher-like sections, and then the cartoon drops the bear trap and picks up another mouth device and then carries on. Next. Cartoon regulation is not screen-bound, nor is it inevitably a case of special effects at your table, but rather a blurring and deregulation of space, which will inevitably produce distorted duplications. Next. 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 There's an example of one of the tracks which I pulled out just to exemplify. That's an Indy 500 racetrack that's been warped and fed back into the pictorial plane of the animation, and the two figures are actually following that loop through a sequence. Next. Where voices no longer match objects, and falling in love with somebody's cartoon will be just like falling in love with somebody. The future is no longer a figment of the imagination, but rather a monster who raises its head in front of a camcorder. Next. Is fed live across the nets and entered into the brains of earthlings. Next. Turning itself into a self-organizing DNA that alters personality and consciousness. Next. Eventually, the entire body is employed to render smarter and smarter machines. Next. More stable, sexy, and wetter than the last batch that came off the genetic Winnebago. Cartoons become permanent addresses. Next. For some people on this planet, Earth must now accommodate a new evolutionary breed, the Humatoon, not stuck in the either-or of fiction or reality, but converting its pathway into a surf wave of reality as it goes. Thank you. There you go, man. That's good. I like that. I like that. I like that. Hi, Michael. How are you?